Yeah, and I was introduced to your site, I don't know, a few months ago. I found out about it probably on Twitter, and immediately found it fascinating because you do some reviews, but mostly you're focused on accessibility breakdowns, right?
Yeah. I mean, the reviews are there basically just to set the context for the accessibility teardowns that follow. Primarily what I'm interested in is just how accessible, in terms of for people with disabilities and such, how accessible are the games that we are playing and enjoying on a regular basis?
And you analyze that from a variety of different perspectives, right? So you have color blindness, even like socioeconomic accessibility. What are your... I can't remember the whole list.
Yeah.
What are the things you're looking at there?
So the general list of things that we go through, I have this grand phrase for it, which is a heuristic framework, and it's basically just a set of bullet points that I go through and analyze each game from each of those perspectives. So one of them is colour blindness, which is obviously a very significant issue. 8% roughly of the male population have some degree of colour blindness, and we all become a little bit more colour blind as we get older. We talk about this kind of topic from the area of visual impairment, so people who usually are not totally blind but have some degree of visual impairment that's going to make it difficult for them to read small text or see lots of symbols and things. I talk about this in terms of fluid intelligence, so that's a kind of academic way of talking about, just for the sake of simplification, if you think of it sort of your processing speed in your mind, your ability to rapidly make decisions and calculate things, which also leads into memory impairments, so your short-term and long-term memory, your ability to remember deck composition or a strategy that you're working on, and whether the board and the game state is going to be there to remind you of what's actually happening. And we also talk about physical issues, so issues with, for example, having to hold large hands of cards, issues of having to reach over the table, issues of having to hide game state from other people. And some of the two of the probably the more controversial aspects of what I cover. I also cover a thing I refer to as emotional accessibility. And that's basically, if you've ever played a game with a bad loser, what are the features of the game that are likely to bring that out in other people? And easily the most controversial of the categories is the socioeconomic section, which talks about business models and issues of representation and diversity and gender and all these different kinds of things. So each of the games gets an analysis in each of those different categories, in which I just talk about the things that are relevant in the game design or the component and the art, and then I give a very misleading letter grade that says, I think this is probably okay, or I think you're going to have major problems with this, and then just see what people say about it.
Yeah, I think you correctly identified something that was just completely missing in the board game space here. And you say, some of the aspects are controversial, and I see, like, on the website you talk about persistently controversial right on the front page. I can't imagine this being controversial. Like, what kind of things have you had to deal with here?
Well, the interesting thing about it is when I started doing this, I also had no idea it was going to be quite so emotive for a number of people. And it's actually, in retrospect, it was silly not to assume that, because I had been a video game researcher, and one of the topics I had covered in a couple of papers was the Gamergate controversy, where, depending on who you talk to, it's either an issue of ethics in games journalism, which we might come to later on in this podcast, or it's a large-scale harassment movement. And I tend to fall into the latter camp of this, thinking this was largely a harassment movement rather than a more noble kind of, we want to get honesty in journalism. So I really shouldn't have been surprised that talking about issues of representation and such in board games was going to be controversial, but I was surprised. And the persistently controversial tagline basically just comes from the fact that if ever anybody posts something from Meeple Like Us on Reddit, if you do the search by controversial, because they have these various headings along the top, there's a fairly good chance that it will be one of the top ones there in terms of upvotes versus downvotes kind of thing. So that's where that comes from.
That's just absolutely incredible to me, because you're not like like obviously you're giving everything a grade, and in some sense, like we all like they're all good metrics, but they're not. I mean, tell me if you disagree, but they're not necessary metrics. Like you talked about the mental, what was the
fluid intelligence and memory.
Fluid intelligence.
Yeah.
Like there are certain games that don't care about that. Like they're trying to be difficult. They're trying to be difficult, deep, hard to grasp experiences, and that's perfectly okay. Other things, like with color blindness, like it'd be fantastic if every game was colorblind, or compatible for people who have colorblind issues or visual issues, just because that's something you can do without changing the mechanics of the game. But to me, like, it's just a fantastic resource, and you can just look at the things that you care about. Like me, none of the people in my game group or myself have issues with colorblindness, so it's not impactful to me, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't be a resource to have this information out there. Like, the internet and you see Reddit constantly amazes me in how petty they can be. Well, about things.
There are some mitigating factors as well, and it's difficult to hide that there may be some genuine reasons to disapprove of the content, because I'm quite arrogant and dismissive of a lot of the people who would say, this is something that you shouldn't be talking about. And that is feedback I've had on occasion, saying, it's not the content, it's the fact that the content is out there. And I don't have a lot of time to make those arguments with people online because I've got other things to do. So I have a reputation on Reddit for being quite dismissive of people, and it's not entirely an unfair portrayal. So there is an extent to which that...
Is this usually with like the gender representation stuff?
Oh yeah.
Is that the main culprit of Reddit hate?
90% of the criticism that I've seen come my way on this has been related to the socioeconomic sections. And it's... Whenever something of mine gets posted to Reddit, it's gotten to the stage that I don't actually read the comments on it. But I have people who do read the comments, and they report back on anything that's interesting or particularly funny. And it's often the case that I'll say to them, anything new? And it's a case that, no, it's just the same stuff you already know. And it's always
just the same thing.
Always the same stuff over and over again. And I absolutely invite real, genuine critique on some of the things that are said there, because I'm not claiming that any of this stuff is actually right. Much like yourself, I'm not impacted by an awful lot of these issues. So it's what I write is from what is basically a theory crafting perspective, as in I am an accessibility researcher, but there's a huge difference between knowing in theory how these things work and how they actually work in terms of a lived experience. So at best I am guessing at these things here, but anybody who has a genuine lived experience that they'll say, oh, what you've said there isn't correct, I will absolutely change the teardowns accordingly. But when it's a case of you shouldn't be talking about this, or this isn't important, or the various kinds of things that tend to be said, I don't have the time to argue those things anymore. I'm an old man. I'm minutes away from the grave at any possible time.
Yeah, and I'm kind of, I guess, in a similar situation where I'm trying to, I don't do accessibility things, but I'm trying to look deeper into, when I do my reviews, deeper into games, and I talk about games culture occasionally, and I post to Reddit occasionally just because it brings traffic in really well, but at least 60% of the comments are just literally nonsensical. There's no consistent line of logic to it. And that really frustrates me, because I want to respond and I want to, have a discussion with people, but it's hard to just say, well, that literally doesn't make sense as an argument.
Yeah, and that's an experience I've also had as well. I tend to assume that anybody who has something that they actually want to bring to my attention, they will either contact me via Twitter, via email, or comments on the site. I tend to think of Reddit as a platform for people to talk about people rather than talk to them, because I don't think it's particularly set up for meaningful discussions. The simple fact, for example, that visibility is based on upvotes and downvotes means that any kind of remotely controversial viewpoint the kind of viewpoints that are likely to make a conversation go someplace interesting are either completely hidden if they become too controversial, or they're pushed down to the bottom of the comment thread, which means that the easy way to get attention on Reddit is to say safe things that everybody agrees with. And that has a corrosive effect on just how interesting conversations tend to be. So I think of Reddit as a platform for basically just, somebody has done something, let's talk about the thing they've done, rather than let's meaningfully engage with what it is they've actually said. And that might be quite dismissive in and of itself, as in, I can understand why saying something like that would kind of annoy the Reddit audience. But the simple fact is, that's looking at how Reddit has worked in terms of talking about the accessibility content for this, and not even just my accessibility content, whenever the topic comes up, it's always unsatisfying to read through the comments, because people are either saying things like, oh, well, you can't cater for a small minority of the population, or people are saying, yes, this is great, but what can we do about it? And then, the meaningful conversation that might come from those things gets voted down.
Yeah, it's built into the format of Reddit.
Mm-hmm.
It's part of, it's the old McLuhan thing, the medium is the message.
Yes.
Right? The message of Reddit is that the most popular things will be seen the most.
Yes, exactly, yeah. I mean, it's kind of the Matthew effect, as they call it. The more visibility something has, the more votes it will get. And if it's something that's highly visible that's also popular, that's what the most dominant posts or the most dominant comment is going to be. That doesn't necessarily mean it's the point or the comment that has the most merit.
Right, exactly. Has most of the kind of controversy with particularly your socioeconomic breakdowns been from Reddit? Because, my experience, I found out about you probably through Twitter.
Yeah.
We've interacted mostly through Twitter.
Yeah.
And that seems, I'm brand new to that platform. I just started it when I started my site. And it seems to be marginally better, maybe,
I mean,
in terms of actually bringing out reasonableness in people. Although, obviously, it has its own issues with the character limit.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think Twitter has the benefit or the drawback, depending on how you want to look at it, of letting you meaningfully construct a kind of echo chamber. So if you want people who have meaningfully interesting views, you can craft your following and follower lists and just not pay attention to the people who you haven't actively curated as like a social group in there. I would say, generally speaking, the conversations I have on Twitter about these kind of issues are much more contentful. And they are often disagreements. They're often, I have a view on something, somebody else has a different view, and we have, believe it or not, within the very tight character limits, we actually have reasonable and interesting conversations about that. So I've had, like, for example, debates about the nature of exclusivity in marketing with podcasts in America. I've had discussions about the nature of epistemological truth with the guys from the Perfect Information podcast, and you wouldn't have thought that from the platform, but I really find Twitter to be really very worthwhile in terms of the sophistication of the discussion that people have. Yeah,
that's been surprisingly my experience. I thought it'd be more vapid than it is, but it's also, as you said, you're able to kind of craft what you see more easily there. So go ahead.
The thing you get with Reddit, of course, is, and it's probably to the credit of the platform, you can't craft your audience there. So you basically get the unedited director's cut of what a conversation would be about it. So with Twitter, you have the ability to make sure that the conversations you have are going to go down the lines that you find valuable. Whereas Reddit is just everybody can say whatever they like, and it'll be upvoted and downvoted, and it'll be a sort of community consensus of it. But you don't get to decide what that consensus is going to be. So it does tend to create, I think, a more critical platform, but simultaneously not a critical platform that is particularly useful for meaningfully engaging in the contours of an argument.
Right. What's the response been to your accessibility breakdowns from the publisher side of thing? Has that been mostly positive, or do they ignore you? How's that been?
Well, it started off ignored completely, which is not surprising considering it was a very, very small site and, hardly anybody was reading it. Increasingly, over the past year or so, publishers have started to become not just interested in the topic, but also receptive to discussing it. So I recently, for example, it's okay for me to talk, I checked with them to make sure they were okay with this being discussed. Check Games sent me a prototype of one of their games to feed in on the accessibility of it at an early stage. And that was a really interesting lens into how this system actually works, because it's easy for me to take a finished product and say, here are the problems with it. It's less easy to do that with a prototype where you're thinking, people might be making financial decisions on the basis of what's said here. It's easy for me to say, do this. But unlike video game accessibility, there's a per unit cost that comes with board games. You make components bigger, you make a box bigger, that means the pallets are bigger, which means the storage is more difficult, which means the transport is more difficult, and that's an issue that you don't have with digital accessibility, which was an area that I was most involved with before. So publishers have become more interested in this, but it also makes the discussions a little bit harder to have because we're in unexplored territory. How do you make these kind of physical recreational products accessible in a way that's not going to actually make a very significant cost to the publisher? Because the business case for this is not made to the same extent it's made in video games. Because again, there is that per unit implication that comes with things. If you make an accessible video game, you broaden a market. If you make an accessible board game, it might be the case that you lose more money than you make. And I don't know if that's actually true, but I also don't know it's not true. So it makes that kind of discussion a little bit more fraught than it might otherwise be.
Well, I imagine at some point, like if particularly if publishers come to you more frequently, like it would be fairly, not simple, but it would be obvious to me at least that you can create a kind of, I guess heuristics is the right word for, like, here are the very simple things you can always do in every game that aren't going to increase your costs or are going to have very minimal cost factors. So like create a baseline just for doing it in general, and then you can talk past that to more specific things.
Well, that's definitely something we're already in the process of working on. We have a big working group of people on a tabletop accessibility project. So the idea is that we're going to put together guidelines for, here's what you absolutely should do. These are just complete straightforward wins that are not going to cost you anything. Here are the things that you maybe should consider doing because it might come at a little bit of a cost, it might be a little bit complicated to design this in, but the benefits are massive. And here's the things that if you wanted to shoot for the moon as far as accessibility goes, here's some things that you might consider, but bear in mind there is going to be an implication for that. So as an example of things in those different categories, colour blindness, make sure everything has an icon to go with it. You've solved your colourblind problem. That's basically all you have to do. Colour can't be the only channel of information. If it is, there are colourblind issues regardless of people actually falling into specific categories of colourblindness, because light and environmental factors all come into this as well. I can barely play Memoir 44 because I can't tell the different pieces apart because my kitchen has terrible lighting. So it's difficult for me to play that, even though I'm not actually colourblind. So if you make sure that this information has multiple formats it can come, then you've solved that problem. It's a big impact. It's 8% of the market. That's not nothing. That is potentially a very big change. Then you have things that are relatively easy to do, but require a little bit of thinking and finessing. Like, for example, if you have a board, a coordinate system on that board makes it so much easier for people to explain where they want things to go on it. And a coordinate system, or it might be a landmark system, like if you're playing Small World and you want to explain to somebody, I want you to put 4 of them there, 4 of them there, and 4 of them there. You need to be able to relate that in relation to a board that doesn't have any identifiers on it other than some, fields and grasslands and hills and such. Whereas if you had names for them, so, put 3 of them on the Hills of Terror and 2 of them on the Herbert Desert or whatever, you've actually got a way of very easily telling people where things should go. And it could be thematic and it could be well integrated into the game, but it does require a little bit of design and consideration around that. And then if you want sort of shoot the moon kind of things, fully voiced text passages that people can read in with a QR code, then suddenly you've solved the problem of people, text-heavy games that you're expecting people with visual impairments or total blindness to be able to play. Sherlock Holmes, the Consulting Detective as an example, has huge long passages in really quite ornate fonts. And it's fine if somebody is happy to read out all of that stuff there, otherwise it's not. But if somebody could just read in with a QR code, then they can just have their device read out to them. But that's costly because it requires somebody to do all the voicing for that. So there's all these different levels that people can do depending on how the finances of this and the audience of these are actually going to line up. But yeah, I mean, we are working on that on an ongoing basis. And the important thing about guidelines like this is it can't just be my theory crafting for this. It has to be people who have lived experiences, because they have a much more interesting and nuanced view on this than I do. And some of the contributors that we have to this have raised some issues that I didn't even consider. We have one contributor, for example, who uses a respirator for breathing, and I had never considered how light pieces might be moved around a board by how a respirator works. But that's something that came up. And light pieces in general are not great, but that is a specific intersection of impairment and accessibility that I hadn't considered. So we have to be kind of nuanced in how we do this, and how we eventually condense what are currently hundreds of suggestions into something that people will actually be able to use as a useful reference. So it's an ongoing project, but yeah, definitely it is something that is hugely important.
Oh, absolutely. And so you have an entire group you're working on this with, right?
Yeah, there's some 30-ish people, I think, who've actually been involved in this to a greater or lesser extent. It includes publishers, it includes manufacturers, it includes designers, and obviously, most importantly, it contains a significant number of people who have disabilities in various categories. So there is a big list of things that are put together as candidate guidelines. We need to go through the process and edit those down into something that's useful, because currently there's maybe 3 or 4 different versions of the same basic advice. And the more guidelines that you have for this, the less likely people are to be able to follow them. So we need to condense it down into a small number of very good guidelines. And that's slow going because there's always other things getting in the way of progressing a big collaborative project. But it is ongoing, yeah.
Is it difficult to kind of edit that because it's inherently difficult to just value or at least maybe give off the impression that you're valuing certain kinds of accessibility over others? Because I imagine, obviously some things are, if something costs $20 per copy of game, that's difficult regardless of what it's doing. But at some point, you have to make value decisions.
Well, you certainly have to make decisions on the publisher designer side of this. So my view of this would be, you are unlikely to make a game that is accessible to everybody. There are a handful of games that we've looked at in Meeple Like Us that I would recommend just to anybody regardless of accessibility considerations. And of the 120-ish that I've looked at just now, maybe 4 games might fall into that category. And they are games that are distinctive in terms of how they actually work. They're not easily emulated. So things like Skull, for example. The game mechanics in there and the game components are quite sparse. So it's easy to have compensations for problems that you might actually have. For example, just if you put a thumbnail notch in one of the discs, then you can tell which one your rose is and which one are your skulls. So you can fix the game doing that. But you can't necessarily take the lessons that you could learn from Skull and apply them to, the next version of Scythe or whatever, because it's a world of difference in terms of the context in which those components actually work. So my view is that, generally speaking, designers should consider one category, maybe at most 2 of those categories, and just not worry about those. And that sounds a bit dismissive, but it's basically just a consequence of the fact that sometimes the inaccessibility is the game. So if you look at something like, for example, Flick 'em Up, that's never going to be particularly physically accessible. You can certainly make it so people could describe to somebody else what they want to happen, but that's not what the game of Flick 'em Up is. The game of Flick 'em Up is flicking a thing at a thing. the inaccessibility of that is actually what makes the game fun. And it's the same with something like a trivia game. The inaccessibility in terms of the accessibility of memory, that's what makes a trivia game fun. The fact that you're asking questions that people have to dig deep and try and answer. So it's not, I think, my place to say what the accessibility focus should be, but rather to say, here's how you can make these particular categories more accessible. You might have to change a little bit of the game to make that happen, or you might get it for free. But the fewer number of categories that you need to worry about, the easier a task that actually becomes. And you mentioned this earlier yourself in the cognitive accessibility category. People like deep, rich, complex games. And that's fine. That's absolutely fine. And if a game is designed around the idea of it being very tactically interesting or strategically interesting or even complicated in terms of its rule structure, it's absolutely fine if you know that's what you're doing. But the problem is if you have a cognitively inaccessible game that you didn't mean to, just because you didn't take into account things like giving people prompts as to what deck composition is.
I mean, to me, going back a little bit to the controversial thing, it seems to me like it was immediately apparent to me that this is what you were doing. But I imagine the people who have problems with it can't make that distinction between you saying, if you're concerned about this kind of accessibility, then you need to do these things as a game publisher. They can't distinguish between that and what they think you're saying, which is all games need to follow all of these standards.
Well, I mean, the ironic thing is, I am virtually impossible to offend. I have yet to find a game that makes me think, that's, clutching at my pearls, oh my god, that's terrible. I have never found content that is completely irredeemable. And that is partially because there is no terrible joke that I haven't told at some point in the right kind of context. But the thing is, that context is what's important. If you want something to be accessible to, for example, young girls, you need to have something that young girls can say, I can see why I should be interested in that. And often it's as simple as just have a girl on the cover of it. Sometimes that's all it needs. Mm-hmm. But I have had these conversations with people about their children, and it's almost always a case of, oh, she won't do that because she thinks it's a boy's thing, or he won't do that because he thinks it's a girl's thing. And play is neither a boy thing or a girl thing. It's a thing that we do. And there's no reason that we should have these assumptions that games have to be for one gender or another. But the way in which they're actually pitched in terms of the box art and such often does that. And if you decide that you want to do something like, let's say, Tanto Curie or Kingdom Death or any of the games where have excessively sexualized minis and the like, that's your choice as long as you know that's what you're doing. And if you decide that's what you're doing, more power to you. I mean, that's a conscious choice that you've made, and it doesn't mean that you're wrong for having made it. But if you're not sure that that's what you're doing, it's useful to then have this little check to say, oh, actually, that's not what I was hoping for. When Shut Up and Sit Down did their Istanbul review, and they talked to the publisher, because they counted through the number of women who were represented on the cards, and they talked to the publisher and said, did you realise that this is what the gender balance was? And they had no idea. And they were really surprised that they had put out a game that had very few representations of women. So it wasn't a conscious choice for them to exclude women in the art. It's just they didn't think to include women in the art. And sometimes that's all it is, just that people are not considering it. But if they are considering it, then they can do whatever the hell they like. It's their game.
Yeah, exactly. It's literally an example of knowledge being power.
Yeah, exactly.
You have the knowledge of it. You then have the capability to actually adhere to whatever values you want. Mm-hmm. Dipping a little bit into the gender representation issue, because, again, this is going back, I guess, to the controversial stuff. But it's another thing that just amazes me about board game culture is that people are so resistant to it. Or at least, people who talk very loudly on the internet are very resistant to it.
That's the important distinction.
That's the key. I don't think I can generalize it farther than that. Like, you've had probably more experience with these kinds of discussion than I have. What do you think, what seems to be the core impetus for people opposing things like having maybe like a random historical game like Istanbul, which is about like trading in a market, right?
Yeah.
Not having very many women, like why do people get upset about it? I want to hear your perspective before I jump in with my own half-baked theories.
Well, I mean, I can give you essentially the arguments I've had put my way. So the most significant of the arguments that gets put my way is it's about keeping politics out of games. Now, the idea behind that is that gender is political. Basically, that's what it comes down to. And there are many people who don't want to have discussions or conversations about gender representation in their games. And it's the kind of thing that they probably wouldn't notice if the game didn't make a thing of it. But if the conversation comes up, they don't want to have that conversation because they are inclusive in their outlook. So, they play games with their significant others, they have women in their gaming groups and so on, so they don't see it as actually being a problem. Or sometimes they're extrapolating from experiences that they've asked other people about. Like, for example, do you feel excluded by the fact that this game does not have any women on the cover? And often the answer to that will be no. And again, it's kind of the obverse of that discussion, because they don't want to have the conversation about this and come across as seeming like they're overly sensitive or such. Because most of the conversations about this also tend to ascribe a particular motive to people, in that they are sensitive snowflakes and these aren't real issues because people aren't really bothered by them, so we shouldn't be talking about them because there's so many more important things to talk about. That's the dominant view of it. In terms of the less dominant viewpoint, because I honestly don't think the majority of people have a problem with this. I mean, as you say, it's the loudest people on the internet. And anybody who uses, for example, the phrase social justice warrior is instantly the most boring person in any conversation. Just right away. Anytime it comes up, I just roll my eyes and think, it's like having a conversation with the world's worst pub bore, because it's a meaningless phrase that doesn't actually have any merit to it. And even if it wasn't a meaningless phrase, how can it possibly be a bad thing? Who actually wants social injustice? You might disagree with what social injustice is, but surely we all want social justice. So it's absolute nonsense. So the smallest minority of these people are honestly, they think of themselves as foot soldiers in a culture war. Mm-hmm. And they're coming across from the Gamergate movement in particular, because there is obviously an overlap between video game fans and board game fans. They're coming across from this, they're being energized by platforms that permit really hostile communities to feed into less hostile communities, and to offer a kind of reinforcements in any kind of argument, that if an issue of gender comes up, they put up the flag, and then all the people from the various other subreddits come in, and essentially, the word is brigading. They come in and they try and support or shore up the anti-inclusion argument of this. Now, it's not a hugely endemic problem in board games just yet, but as board games become bigger and as they become a more visible battleground for this, there are elements of the alt-right, basically, who are coming in and making this a battleground. The majority of people, if they're not... I mean, it's entirely possible to have a viewpoint saying it doesn't matter and not be sexist or misogynist or racist or whatever. You can have that viewpoint. You can argue that theme is important enough that representation shouldn't matter. But there are a very significant minority of people who have made this an actual ethical, a moral issue for them, that this is a conversation that cannot be had because it has, quote-unquote, destroyed video games, and they don't want it to destroy board games in the same way.
My perspective, I think, is probably a hair unique in that, like, I'm a Christian and I grew up in a conservative household, and, I was taught pretty small O orthodox kinds of things about gender and gender roles and all that. And I'm still fairly conservative, I suppose, depending on what definition you're applying. And me and my peers from when I grew up were in the same kind of subculture. By and large, what we were taught and what we kind of, our priors, I guess, our ethical priors based on our upbringing, is so completely different than what we're seeing with these people who get so angry about any kind of discussion of gender representation or anything. And the problem is that it gets attributed to us. I speak very broadly, American white Christians, I suppose, when it's a very strange outcropping. I don't even know if it's from Protestant Christianity, but it's difficult then to have any kind of discussion about it, because there's this, I guess you could call the alt-right, who just dominate the quote-unquote conservative side of things with just trying to shut down discussion altogether. And so from my perspective, it's just a very strange segment that doesn't feel like it's tied to me and my my perspectives or my upbringing, but it kind of is by name alone, I guess.
Well, I think one of the issues that we have in this particular field is that, I say the vast majority of people are not bad people who have bad thoughts. That's not the issue here. But the thing is, the board game community online skews hugely male. The figures I saw from Board Game Geek were something like a 95, 96, 97% male split. That is not an environment in which diversity is actually a thing on most people's agenda, because these are issues that are invisible unless you're actually directly impacted by them. If you don't see yourself represented, you notice that. But if you're represented in everything, it's easy to think everybody feels that same way. In a very, very small way, I'm Scottish, you've probably noticed. And one of the things that's particular about Scottish culture is that it, much like other kinds of minority groups, is represented primarily as a stereotype. So bagpipes, haggis, shortbread, kilt, bagpipes, all those different kinds of things. And that's not what Scotland is at all. Scotland is a country like every other country. It has its good sides and its bad sides, but it's not the caricature that people see. But when I look at something like Isle of Skye or Shot and Totten or any game that involves Scotland, it's this shortbread tin representation of Scotland that I see. And it's fine for me because I'm not actually an oppressed group. That's not an issue. It's a little bit eye-rolling is all. But other people can look at that who see their cultures represented. That's not an issue for them, because why would it be? It's a joke, get over it kind of thing. And that's certainly the case for me, because, as I say, Scots are not an oppressed minority. But if the same thing is happening to an oppressed minority, back in the 80s, when I was growing up, the idea of somebody going on television or going onto an entertainment program and speaking in a Scottish accent was it was just not done. And then a band called the Proclaimers came along, and they went on Top of the Pops, which is one of our TV shows where we did these kind of things, and they sung a song in a broad Scottish accent, and I had internalized the lessons of British culture at the time to the point that I thought, they can't do that. That sounds so provincial, that's terrible. And it wasn't. It was just Scottish people singing in a Scottish accent. It was just I had been conditioned not to think that was okay. So as part of the general discussion around these kind of areas, the simple fact that there are so many people who are surrounded by men, primarily white men, primarily straight white men, that creates a particular kind of consensus as to what this hobby actually looks like. And it's not actually true when you go out into real life, into real groups. So the conversation online is hugely skewed. But the other thing is the extreme end of this. So when we're talking about, for example, the alt-right, that's a really clever bit of branding, because what it does is associate this, what is essentially a hate group, with right-wing thinking. And that's not really what it is. It's entirely possible that the people who are on the alt-right versus the people who are on the hardest fringes of the left, they share an awful lot in common. Most people tend to fall within a far more reasonable spectrum of expectations, to the point that, yeah, okay, I don't think this is an issue, to other people thinking, I think this is an issue. But very few people take it as a personal insult when the topic comes up. So when the alt-right have associated themselves with, for example, normal's not the right word, but sort of this harkening back to this idea of an idealized, primarily America, where everybody knew their place and family roles were well defined, and there was this normal idea of what gender and sexuality should be. What they're essentially doing there is that they are trying to lend credibility to a viewpoint by a very clever bit of branding. There are people who say that you should not refer to the alt-right as the alt-right, that you should call them Nazis or you should call them fascists or whatever it is. Problem is, that's a ridiculous idea because it is so easily dismissed. Because the alt-right isn't the Nazi movement. The alt-right isn't, just hardcore misogynists or racists. Everybody in there has their own little blend of their own particular beliefs for these kind of things. So if you point to somebody and say, oh, you're a Nazi, well, it's easy to be a racist without being a Nazi, or it's easy to be a misogynist or a harasser without being a racist. Those kind of labels that people apply to this don't work, because while they are effective and shocking when used in the right kinds of contexts, they're not convincing to the vast majority of people because they're not actually representative. So this alt-right label is, let's not pretend that the alt-right are not fantastic at branding. Right-wing,
right.
The right wing in general have, like the extreme right wing, have always been good at branding because the ideas are relatively reprehensible and it's the only way they can sell them. If you go back to the 40s and the Nazi Party, say what you like about the Nazis, and I think very few of us are going to say something nice about them, but they understood the value of branding. The Nazis were so well branded that even the most reprehensible historical evidence is not enough to destroy them in modern eyes. And that's what the alt-right is. It's a tremendously effective branding exercise that hides just how reprehensible it is by making it seem like an extension of our normal society. And that's not how it actually works. It's far more corrosive than that. Well, that's a digression.
Yeah, that's a digression, but
it's talking about board
fascinating
games at one
one
point,
to me. And one thing I think is very key to the rise of these radical right-wing groups is that they're always reacting to something. They're anti-something. They're not pro-anything.
No.
So they're reacting then to the most extreme of left-wing views, which the vast majority of people would also dismiss as silly. And because I think for many reasons, dealing with how the media is structured in the internet and the incentives in play there, big, loud, scary voices are heard more. And thus, there's always going to be some kind of reactionary group like this. And it deliberately paints the world into these two extremes that don't actually represent what people actually think.
Exactly.
But I've seen it from the conservative side. It draws people in because, particularly in America, we've had this narrative of a culture war and of Christians needing to take back society, which is, by the way, rooted in poor theology. That started back in the 80s with Falwell and the silent majority movement thing. And it's just pulling off of that narrative into more radical views. And where I came into it, I my perspective was shaped by kind of right Christian libertarian views. So when all of a sudden I see now this political subgroup is now super authoritarian, it's very strange to me. But if you think of it in terms of they are reacting to a super authoritarian radical left-wing ideology, it makes a bit more sense. But as you said, they're kind of two sides of the same coin because they end up both being very authoritarian.
Yeah. And the interesting thing about it as well is that if you look into the way the alt-right and, splinter groups within that tend to work, they tend to work on a recruitment system that is all but indistinguishable to how many of the groups that they rail against work in real life. They are systems of radicalization where people are recruited to a cause through a systematic playbook that is all but indistinguishable to what, for example, ISIS use. Very, very similar kinds of strategies to it. You work to isolate people from their context. You work to make them feel as if they're powerless in a system that is designed to keep them powerless. You give them a voice that they don't otherwise have. You continually move their viewpoints on a little bit further. I mean, nobody recruits somebody to the Nazi Party by saying, hey, come join the Nazi Party. It's always a very small series of steps that are logical in and of themselves. And they only really make sense when you look at them in context over the long period of time. So these kind of recruitment methods are used to radicalize mostly disaffected young men. And that's, I think, where you tend to see where a lot of these attitudes tend to seep in. Because it's not just the individual person, it's how that individual person influences the people around them. And that's where the corrosiveness of these kind of political views tends to come in.
Right, and to try to pull this tangent back into board gaming, I think we see attitudes where people are so resistant to ideas of representation or like having a woman on the cover of the board game because they are fed the line that if they believe that those things are good, they have become part of a different subgroup.
Yeah.
But to do some amateur sociology, people act in the way that they think that the kind of person they are should act.
Yeah.
Right? I'm pretty sure that's a pretty standard,
yep,
if poorly worded, idea in sociology. And therefore, if they are told over and over and over that if you act like diversity matters, then you are some kind of radical left-wing zealot, then they retreat back into their own corner.
And there's an interesting concept from political science here, the Overton window, which is the idea that ideas are expressed within certain acceptable parameters. And if you want to change what those acceptable parameters are, you need to essentially shift that window over to particular viewpoints. Now, as an example of this, the idea of left-wing versus right-wing in America is wildly different from the idea of left-wing versus right-wing in Europe. It's just...
Oh, yeah, completely.
Those two, they just do not mean the same thing. Our most right-wing politicians are probably to the left of America's most left-wing politicians. In terms of economic views, in terms of social views, that's just how it's actually worked. And it's because continental viewpoints hugely influence British viewpoints, and American viewpoints also influence British viewpoints, but Europe is closer. So we have a more European view of what politics actually is. Now that's changing. I mean, these things always change, and very rarely for the better, but this is actually changing. But nonetheless, what we've got there are two conceptions of what an Overton window looks like. Left-wing in America is not left-wing anywhere else. So if you want to actually make it so that these kind of conversations are part of the normal discourse, then you have to make it so that the Overton window shifts towards where those kind of things are generally considered to be day-to-day topics of conversation. Noam Chomsky also wrote a thing very similar about this in a book, Manufacturing Consent. And the idea is that society structures do not want views of a particular type expressed because they are corrosive to powerful structures in society. And while that's a relatively radical view of how it works, it's also quite well demonstrated in that you have this progression from things being, you cannot have this thought, this is a thought that we will not tolerate in society, to them becoming, actually, you can have these thoughts if you're like a radical free thinker. And you can see that, for example, in terms of the rise of kind of neo-fascism in many countries across the world. It used to be the case that was an unthinkable proposition. You couldn't in society express a neo-Nazi position and expect to come away from it, feeling good about the exchange. And then it became radical. So you've got organizations like Breitbart and the like who are essentially putting out what were previously unthinkable viewpoints, and they're making them less unthinkable by making them merely radical. And then they become acceptable. They become things that's just part of what discourse is. And then they don't just become acceptable, they become just generally, yes, this is what we think about this. And then they become popular things, as in everybody thinks this particular way, and eventually they just become governmental policy. So it's a gradual process of making these things less unthinkable by a kind of an immersion therapy. Just make it so people are hearing these things over and over and over again, and then they'll think that's what actual discourse is. And when you're looking at issues of representation and the like, we have actually reached this point where it's no longer unthinkable to be against diversity. I mean, maybe that was never the case in America, but certainly in Scotland, maybe 10, 15 years or so, we would have very significant anti-racism campaigns on, newspapers, on billboards, on TV. And they really did change the way people approached it, because certainly in the 80s, Scotland was an incredibly racist place. People had no problem at all using very derogatory racial slurs to refer to fast food chains and everything. It was just a thing that you did. And then it became radical. It became not policy for that, then it became, from being popular to being unacceptable, to then being a case that you were a bit of an asshole if you had those kind of views and were expressing those. And it was the kind of thing that you were embarrassed by your parents at, Christmas or such when they expressed these kind of views. And now it's not that they're unthinkable, but it's the case that they are very unpopular views to have. And that was very much the case for Scotland. But now it's shifting the other way. And it's shifting the other way in a very predictable way through this kind of immersion thing. So the more culturally accepted a particular kind of message is, the more people tend to assume that's the default. And currently it's the case that diversity is becoming the default position of the tedious internet, virtue signaling white knight, as they tend to say. And people don't want to particularly be associated with that. And the more that becomes the dominant narrative, that's what people tend to assume with it. And because nobody wants to be this virtue signaling person, you tend to adopt the alternate viewpoint so that people don't think that's what you are.
It seems to me that the solution, as it were, is to just make kind of basic common sense, or just to make being a reasonable person.
Yeah.
Who thinks about things, the kind of culturally dominant rhetoric, but that's incredibly hard to do because there's no tagline along with that. There's no catchphrase. There's very
little precedence.
And there's no easy way to brand that. I mean, it's not a reactionary view. It's not a radical view. It's not something that feels good, right? It doesn't feel good to doubt oneself.
No.
Or to question your own perspective, or to not respond to something, but rather just think about it. And so I think, to me, and I think it's exacerbated by just the fact of how the internet functions with anonymity and being able to say something and then leave it behind and not have a direct reaction from someone. And I think those are very clear, and I'm not anti-internet, obviously, but they're very clear issues with the internet that make a reasonable perspective very difficult to maintain while becoming popular on the internet or whatever, or pushing your brand or getting noticed.
Well, one of the things I've said on occasion is that I don't think civility survives internet scale. And by that I mean that when you've got platforms like Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, unless they're very tightly controlled and designed in such a way that they're like very extreme moderation policies and such come in, then when you have these things emerge as grassroots discussion groups, the norms are emergent, and because the norms are emergent, if you don't actually have a culture of civility baked into the kind of conversations you have, then civility is just not going to survive that, because it's easier to get attention by being extreme.
Yeah, exactly. I know kind of what the solution would look like, in that everyone would be civil, but it's hard to say how to get there.
Yeah, but especially because people disagree on what civility actually is.
Yeah, that too. I suppose I'll cap off this tangent by saying I think you're doing a great job in bringing civility, even though you say you're controversial. I think it's because you're reasonable and civil, and you provide a great service. So,
thank you very much.
Thank you for that. Let's jump back into actual board gaming stuff for a second. As fascinating, and I'm not saying that entirely.
No, that's fine. If this gets edited out, I wouldn't be surprised.
No, I'm going to keep the discussion. I'll edit some of my stumblings about. But let's jump to something completely lighter.
Yeah.
What are your favorite board games?
In terms of what my absolute favourite one is, it has to be Concordia. Concordia is the game that consistently gives me the most entertainment for the least investment of awkwardness. But it's probably not the one that I tend to play the most often, because I think you need the right kind of people around the table to really get the most out of it. And when I'm playing with groups of people, I'm often essentially trying to convert them to the cause. Mm-hmm. And Concordia is not a great vehicle for that, because you pull it out and it's got the austere looking board and all the classical symbols and all the different cards and things in it. People look at it and think, I really wish I hadn't come around now. I'd much rather be doing something else with my time. So I tend to pull out things like Sheriff of Nottingham, or mostly Sheriff of Nottingham, to be honest, which is the default really easy sell for why this is something people should be interested in. But yeah, Concordia, absolutely my favourite one. Five Tribes is one that I spend a lot of time thinking about, even when I'm not actually playing it, because just such a clever set of mechanics that emerge from a very simple rule set. And obviously,
well, I think the key in Five Tribes is the bidding system.
Oh yeah,
it's just brilliant, just brilliant.
I mean, the thing with Five Tribes is you can look at this board for hours and hours and hours and never come up with the optimal move, because there's just so much that could potentially happen. And while that does tend to create the circumstance in which people take minutes and minutes and minutes to make a move, it also means that you can spend time thinking, there is a game here that I could spend my lifetime playing and never actually master. And that's quite unusual for... I mean, there are some tremendously deep and rich and resonant games in modern board gaming, but there's comparatively few that I look at and think, that's going to survive the same way chess does. That it has that level of depth and complexity in it. And I think Five Tribes probably won't survive the same way chess does, but I think it would be a candidate for him.
Yeah, I could see that. I'm not quite as big on Five Tribes. I think the bidding's great, but it does obviously have that problem where certain people can just get stuck and take forever to play the game. But if you get the right group of people, it's fantastic.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
That's great. I actually haven't played Concordia yet, and it kills me because it's high at the top of my list, especially after I saw the Shut Up and Sit Down review of games that I really want to play.
Well, it was the
It seems right up my alley.
It was the Shut Up and Sit Down review that I thought, right, I'm going to buy that one. I'm just going to buy it. I'm not going to prevaricate or anything, just going to buy it. And then suddenly it was out of print everywhere, because that's what happens when Shut Up and Sit Down are enthusiastic about something. And it was sort of a point of pride to me that I had this copy of this game that hardly anybody had. And it was really, really good. And it's, you get to crow a bit when you say, oh yeah, I've played Concord. Oh, you don't have it? Well, you should have been faster off the mark. And yeah, it sort of has pride of place in my collection, just because A, it's a great game, and B, because it's really, it was really, really hard to get hold of.
Mm-hmm. And so do you tend to find yourself liking more on the American to European style of games? You like the more toward the European style?
I don't know. I mean, I think over the past 5-10 years or so, it's become a less and less clear distinction as to whether they're Euro games or Ameri trash, thrash, whatever you want to say for that.
Yeah.
Increasingly, it's become the case that even what would have been considered sort of dry Euros a while ago are now quite thematic in the way their mechanics and such actually work. I think probably I lean more towards mechanics than theme, but it depends on the theme. There's thematic by itself isn't enough, but if you can have a really, really good theme that I am, wedded to in terms of like an intellectual property or a concept or such, that can overcome an awful lot of mechanical limitations. And I think probably the best example of what I actually have here for that would be something like Firefly the game, which is not a great game, but is a fantastic implementation of Firefly as a universe. And while it's not something I particularly want to play very often, it's something that I will never get rid of, because as an artifact of Firefly, it is just phenomenal. And I'm a huge Firefly fan, so it's never going away as a result of that. So yeah,
the thing that made me fall in love with that one is the money, the design on that money. It's so good. Every
single bit of it is just so fantastically loving. There's nothing in it that is perfunctory. There's nothing was just, let's slap the Firefly license on a thing. Even though the game is a fair bit longer than I think it's worth for what you get out of it. If I want a game like that, I'm probably going to play Merchants and Marauders. But even with the fact that they could have just slapped Firefly on this and sold it anyway, it's obviously done by somebody who really, really wants to make Firefly come to life in a board game, and they've succeeded that tremendously.
The example for me would actually be Battlestar Galactica, Battlestar Galactica game. Even though when I first played it, I had not seen the television series.
Right.
It does. Have you played that one?
I've got it, but I've never actually played it.
It does such a good job at simulating partial cooperation, because there are these crises and you need to reach a certain threshold of certain types of skills.
Yeah.
But everyone plays their cards face down, and just bringing the paranoia into the game just from that very simple mechanic, I think it's fantastic. Even though, like Firefly, it can go on a bit too long. Well,
it's one of these ones I've seen played quite a bit and think I would love to get a group together where we could actually play that one. But as I say, an awful lot of the groups I actually play these things with, unless they have come into the orbit of board games already, I'm probably in the process of recruiting them to the cause, as opposed to really taking advantage of them being sort of solid gamers. So Battlestar Galactica is one of these ones I look at and think, I don't think I can realistically teach that in the time I have available, because that's the other thing as well.
Yeah.
Time is such a precious commodity, and once you're middle-aged, getting people together where you can spend an evening playing a game, that's a logistical nightmare. You can maybe get 2 people together of an evening, that's not a problem. 3 people together for an hour, okay, that's probably fine. 4 people together for any longer, that's something you need to plan for weeks in advance. And it's very easy for those plans to fall apart because people have children, they have jobs, they have all kinds of things that are just stopping them just sitting down and taking advantage of these kind of long, engaging and quite immersive experiences.
I'm fortunate that I'm able to have a kind of a regular group to play. A regular group who enjoys really long games.
Yeah, that's a luxury.
Like my wife's favorite game is Twilight Imperium. She pretty much only plays really long games right now because she likes the freedom to kind of just do whatever you want. But I'm dreading the day when someone moves away or I go to a different city. It'll be hard. Let's move now to kind of the final topic I wanted to cover, which is the state of criticism in board gaming. I know we had a few discussions on Twitter about when you posted something about how you found out that people were charging publishers for reviews.
Yeah.
And since then, it's been very bizarre. I had a little podcast about it. I wrote about it a little bit. And I've had a genuinely strange mix of responses where it's like 1/3 of people are like, wow, yeah, I can't believe that's happening. You should go and out everyone who's doing this and create a blacklist or something. And I'm like, I don't want to do that. And then 1/3 of people are like, I don't care. That I assumed that everyone was paid under the table anyway. Yeah. And then 1/3 are like, well, they got to be paid somehow.
Yeah.
And has it been genuinely surprising to you, as it has to me, that there aren't more people upset about it?
I mean, it's been surprising, but I think more than anything else, it's just been a little bit depressing. I saw the Reddit thread about that, and the number of people who were saying, as you say, you should name and shame, etc., etc. If you don't name and shame, then there's no validity in this because we can't, we don't know who's involved. And I mean, I kind of understand that viewpoint, but the simple fact is the Facebook group is a closed group. People are saying things with an expectation of disclosure that is limited to that group. And it's not necessarily ethical to report on semi-private conversations that people have that they engaged in on the understanding they were semi-private. But yeah, I mean...
Well, and also, the other thing I said is that if I was to release a name, I would want to be 110% sure.
Yeah.
And I don't want to do all that research or, email people out of the blue. That's just, it doesn't seem like it's my place to do that kind of thing.
No, and I mean, there are numerous cases. I mean, I've actually left that Facebook group now because it genuinely just made me a little bit sad on a regular basis, and I thought, there's enough in the world that already makes me a little bit sad. I don't need this one as well. Because there was very recently a post about, there was a publisher who was putting together an affiliate program where reviewers would get review copies, and they would get financially compensated on the basis of the traffic that they sent to the publishers, which basically means you either write a good review or you don't get that money, because people, generally speaking, won't check out a bad game. So that was just, again, another conflict of interest, and when the conversation came around to that, and people were essentially saying, oh, this seems great, and, well, reviewers, we put in all this effort, therefore we should be rewarded for this effort, I just decided that was the point, that there's no need for me to be tracking this because it doesn't seem to bother people as much as it bothers me.
Yeah. I actually responded to that, and I said, can I get on the list but not be part of the compensation system? And I haven't got a response yet. I just want to I'm just trying to get review copies, right? I'm trying to get my name out there. I'm trying to get more new games to help my website, but I don't want to be compensated. My alternate strategy is now seeing if I can go to them and ask if I can funnel all of the money into some kind of charity.
Oh, okay. I mean,
that might be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I would honestly have no ethical problem with that, because I mean, the problem I have with these kind of issues, well, there's two problems. The first one is board gaming is still a very, very small community, and the money involved is not huge. And already these are ethical issues that are emerging in terms of people taking money for providing editorial viewpoints and such on games. And my worry is, what happens if the growth continues? Because this is a 20-30% growth rate per year, certainly according to Stadium in the UK. When there's actual real sums of money in here, the ethics are already problematic for a number of people for what are relatively small sums of money. What happens when those sums of money become much, much larger? And those are sort of precedents I don't really want to see set here, because harkening back to the stuff we talked about in Gamergate, they did have a point. And that was one of the most annoying things about it. The idea that games journalism in video games was ethically compromised from root to stem was actually a realistic and fair portrayal, I think, of an awful lot of outlets. And it was one of the things that, if you are willing to be charitable about the motivations of some people in Gamergate, and I think certainly the later phases of it genuinely were driven by this idea of it's about ethics in video games, I don't want to see that happening in board games, because it was hugely corrosive in video games. So I don't want to see those ethical problems being accepted as standard now, because if this does become the huge industry that it might be, they'll only become more intense as time goes by. So this is a kind of self-preservation thing, as in there is an ethical duty for people who do these kind of things to not make the community, fracture with this kind of thing. But as you say, I mean, people don't really care very much, and that also bothers me, because the quality. Just say something here that's probably going to put me on the hit list of anybody who's actually involved in writing these kind of things. The quality of a lot of board game coverage is not particularly high. For example, they're driven mostly by rules overviews. There's relatively little genuine criticism, and there's very little example of anybody trying to dig in particularly deeply into how mechanics work and how they inform, the game itself. Now, that's not universal. There are some people doing some fantastic work in that, but a lot of the content is kind of perfunctory, in that you regurgitate the manual and then you throw a score on it, and that's your review. And that's also what a lot of people want. And I think that's kind of frustrating to look at, to see that people have this idea that, don't tell me what you think of the game, just tell me the rules and I'll work out myself whether the game is good. Because that's nonsense, for one thing, because any game that you can tell how it's going to play just from the rules, I don't think people can do that realistically. I mean, you might get a fair idea of it, but games should surprise you, and generally speaking, they usually do. So there's very little incentive for people to actually try and do better with these kind of things, because the community as a whole, the majority of them, seem to be quite happy with A, financial compensation in reviews, and B, relatively little critical content in those reviews. And we also have a very significant problem in terminology, in that a number of extremely dubious ethical practices are being accepted because they have been labelled in a particular kind of way. Review versus preview, for example. Mm-hmm. People often act as if the word preview is an inoculation against allegations of ethical misconduct. But the simple fact is, an awful lot of the previews that are put out there are reviews just under a different name. They might be on early access versions of board games, but they still are subjective, evaluative, often semi-critical, as in they are providing a critique rather than being negative about it. These are reviews just under a different name. And we've also come to accept that, well, previews, they're all paid, aren't they? So we don't have to worry about this. But there's still editorial content going into these things, and I think that's where the ethical issue lies.
The language thing is so baffling to me that there's so little distinction between, or really in many cases no distinction between what people would call a preview and what people would call a review. And I come from not really the background, but at one point in college I wanted to do semi-seriously film reviews. And in doing movie reviews, it's very clear what kind of the structure of it and what you're trying to do, right? There's the famous Roger Ebert quote of, "It's not what the movie is about, it's how it's about it."
Yeah.
And then I get into this world of board gaming all of a sudden, and I find, the Dice Tower who I think get too much flack, because I blame more of the people who just follow that same format. The Dice Tower is just trying to be an encyclopedic resource.
Exactly, yeah.
They're going for quantity.
Yeah.
And that's fine.
Quantity is a quality on its own, as they say.
Yeah, and I see, this kind of reviews out of the board gaming world, and I'm not seeing anything where it's where the people are looking at how the game actually accomplishes what it's trying to do, or doesn't accomplish what it's trying to do. It's only just what the game is trying to do.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of where I came in. I'm like, okay, I'm going to try to actually talk about if the mechanisms work, and if they do, why they work in one way or not another way, and trying to actually get to the root of this. But I keep hearing people say that the audience doesn't care about it, and I think I'm too small at this point to see the backlash. But I've heard of other reviewers where they say, yeah, my audience doesn't want me to do that. They just want me to go over the rules and then give a grade. And I'm stubborn enough where I'm not going to do that, but it's a bit worrying that I'm like artificially limiting who will ever want to read my reviews. And I think your point about, if we have the ethical issue right now with regard to paid content from the publishers, like, it's important to establish a standard now before before it gets too big, before the industry gets too big. And to me, it's just absolutely baffling that people aren't more concerned about the principle of the matter. And as I said in the podcast where I talked about this, it seems incredibly straightforward to me that if you say you are a reviewer of board games, what you're implicitly implying is that you are serving potential customers or potential buyers of these board games.
Yeah.
But if you take money from the publisher, it's contradictory. Now it says I'm serving the publisher's interests. And it's not like this is unprecedented both in ethics and in not only in journalistic ethics, but in ethical situations in any business, governmental ethics or business. Like, there's a reason conflict of interest is a phrase in our language. It's because it's incredibly important. And it goes back to even like an American government, like the reason we don't vote for federal judges. We don't have any elections for that. Federal judges are appointed by the president and then confirmed by the Senate. And the reason is because the judges aren't serving the people at large. That's what the representatives are doing. the judges are serving the Constitution.
Yeah.
And so, like, there's a reason we have the institutions the way they are. And in board gaming right now, it just seems to be a complete mess.
Yeah. I mean, I have a draft of a post on the topic that I haven't published because it is, every time I look at it, I think that's a bit more incendiary than I intended it to be. And I've never quite had the time to go back and edit it to the point that there's more light than heat coming from it, because at the moment it's all heat. And yeah, I mean, basically the core point that I make in this, and it's a very similar point to the one you made in your podcast, which is what's important here is that my incentives align with what the audience's incentives are. So if if my interests are aligned with a publisher, then my interests are no longer aligned with the audience of the work. And when that happens, we have a word for that. It's called advertising. And that's fine. I mean, there's nothing wrong with people being advertisers. But the problem is when people think advertised content is in some way beholden to the audience of that content. Nobody thinks that an advertisement on TV is aimed at giving them the best information they need to make an informed decision about a product. It's there to sell a thing to you or to make a positive association in your mind with a thing on TV. And there are a very significant number of examples of content that is pitched as either critical or editorial or a preview, when really what it is an advertisement. And there's an expectation of disclosure there, but I also think that once you actually are in the business of providing advertising to a publisher, it also provides a reason for people to distrust the rest of the content, because even if a specific thing that you're putting out there is not remunerated, there's always going to be the expectation that remuneration will come in the future. So if you provide a bad review of a game for a company, and they say, we are no longer going to be hiring your services for providing previews or whatever for this kind of content, you are incentivized, even not with terms of money, but with avoiding the loss of a revenue stream. So I personally cannot trust the critical content of anybody who has taken money to provide an advertisement. And that's something people can decide upon, and it surprises me, much like yourself, that people aren't more concerned about that. That what they're actually getting is content that is skewed towards the financial requirements of the person providing the content. And a lot of people will say things like, well, all reviews are biased. And okay, that's kind of true in that all reviews are subjective and none of them can be measured according to a particular yardstick. But you want those biases to be the biases that are aligned with you as an audience, rather than the ones that are aligned with the publisher. And yeah, I mean, we have a word for when that happens. It's a conflict of interest. And it's not enough, in my view, to simply disclose this is happening. And there have been recent controversies about particular outlets who have not provided enough disclosure on things. Like, for example, it's like a 30-second or 3-second thing at the end of the video. But it's still the case that I think if you have taken this kind of thing, I have to be concerned about your relationship with publishers, because why would you put something negative out if this is actually something that is going to be sustaining a career that you actually want to have there? So when you have people like Shut Up and Sit Down, The Dice Tower, Actual All recently, who run Patreons, and they get paid, or they run Kickstarter campaigns and they get a chunk of money from their readership, that's absolutely fine, because that means that their incentives are aligned with their audience. When that money comes from a publisher, you are beholden to that publisher. And it's not in my interests for you to tell me what a publisher wants me to know. The publisher can do that. So if you're speaking with the publisher...
and you already know what the publisher wants you to know.
They want you to buy the game.
They want you to buy the game.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. And yeah, I mean, we can say that we understand that there are issues of compensation and such, and we can say, I understand that and I take that fully into account when I interpret these views. But precedent suggests that we are not great at assessing our own biases. I mean, there's a whole branch of cognitive psychology that is about how bad we are at making rational decisions. If you have a look on, not the world's greatest source, but if you have a look at Wikipedia on the topic of cognitive biases, there's hundreds of these little cheat codes in the human mind that mean that we are forever riven by problems in analytical thought that if we don't know they're there, we don't know they're there. We don't know to compensate for them. And things like selection bias and, recency effects and all these different kinds of things hugely distort the way that we look at issues. And when we're actually looking at a thing and saying, I am properly taking into account all of the issues that go along with this, we're probably not, because we're just not wired that way. We have evolutionary firmware that doesn't work in that way, and our minds are not completely rational machines. But we need to know that we cannot be trusted to make these rational decisions, and we need people to essentially do what they do to minimize the fact that we can't properly weigh this kind of thing. Because if somebody we like says something good about a game that we want to like, the fact that they were paid to do that, we're not going to properly factor into decision making. And it's exactly the kind of thing that comes with review copies, as in, when you raise this topic with board game reviewers and book reviewers and movie reviewers and all these different kinds of people, they will say it doesn't have an impact on what I say about this game. And I'm willing to bet in close to 100% of cases they will even believe that. But the simple fact is, there is no reason to believe that getting something for free is not going to have an impact on what you say. And the fact that it has an impact is one thing, but you have to be aware that's a possibility and you have to control for it. Saying there is no ethical issue to go with this means that what you're essentially doing is abrogating the responsibility for properly controlling for factors that you are aware might actually be there.
And it's something I have actually experienced once I've started getting review copies, is that I'm thinking about, okay, what kind of score am I going to give this game? And then particularly on a recent review, I really was second guessing myself, and it wasn't a very good game at all, and I was going to give it a bad score regardless, but it's like I was stuck between two numbers, and I'm like, well, am I just giving it a pass because it was a review copy? I don't think I am, but you have to consider it. And this is where it gets a bit tricky in terms of the ethics, because it's like, well, you say you can't get paid, but a review copy is a kind of payment, and it's humbling. And I think you're correct that review copies, there is something there that you have to take account of, but I think it's probably still a net positive that they are generally considered acceptable.
Oh yeah, I mean,
in all kinds of different journalistic ethics.
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly not going to say
on balance, though.
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly not going to say that review copies are a bad thing. I think they are a necessary part of what a reviewer culture actually requires. Nobody can be expected to buy everything because there's just too much out there. But the fact that it is overall a useful thing that keeps the wheels turning doesn't mean it doesn't actually have potentially an effect on this. And it's not the fact that there's an effect that's the problem. It's the fact that so many people will say there is no effect. So the key thing for me is being willing to acknowledge that we are not necessarily completely rational in these kind of things. That when we actually get... I mean, it's an incredibly privileged thing to be able to get a review copy. And it tends to distort a number of things in terms of the evaluation. Because if it comes to something like, and I've posted about this in the past, if it comes to something just like the value proposition, what am I going to say that's meaningful about, let's say, an £80 game that comes my way for nothing? How can I realistically say that I can just completely discount the fact that that's £80 of content coming my way? And I don't think we can. But I think what we can do is say, I understand this might have an impact on what I think about it, and I'm going to try and control for it. Now, again, we're not necessarily always going to be right about that, and it's often the case that controlling for it can go too far the other way. I heard somebody say recently that if they got a review copy of something, they were more likely to review it negatively because buying something tends to create an incentive for you to argue why you did something sensible. And that's probably also true, but it's not any better for you to be biased the other way than biased in the game's favour. It's still something that you have to take into account and try and control for. So yeah, absolutely, this is something that is hugely useful, but it's also something we need to be aware of and just be honest with ourselves that we can't guarantee that it has no impact on what we think about a game.
Yeah, and the ultimate irony here is that board games are a fantastic tool for learning to overcome your own psychological biases. Like, I've written about this before. Jeff Engelstein talks a lot about this, that, board games are basically, almost all board games are just a system of economic incentives, right? And that means that the same kind of cognitive biases that you would encounter in real life, you encounter in board games, but there's a really, really clear success metric, and that is, whether or not you win or how well you do in the board game. And part of that is measuring how well you have overcome your own cognitive biases. So it's a little bit funny to me that this is now a major discussion in board game criticism when board games are basically teaching us to do this the right way.
Yeah. And it is, I agree entirely when you say it is baffling that this is not considered a more significant issue. Because when this is actually a business that does have, when there is the first board game company with a multi-billion-dollar market cap, when real money starts to flood into the reviewer ecosystem, it's going to be far more difficult for people to say no, because the precedent has already been set and the audience has already said, it's fine. And it's largely the audience reaction for this that's going to drive what is considered acceptable for reviewer standards, because if the audience doesn't care, it doesn't really matter what you want to do. You can write the most ethically pure blog in the world, but if nobody reads it, you have no ability to actually get your message out there. So you're very much driven by what the audience wants, which in itself is also a bias that we need to take into account.
Again, like we had with our earlier discussion, there's not an easy path to making this right, I guess, other than just talking about it like we are now. Like, talking about calmly and reasonably and just presenting our case to people.
Well, the thing is, the issue with ethical decisions is they're not easy to make. Sort of irrelevant here, but just sort of set the scene for this. I'm heading off to Switzerland at the weekend to give a talk on ethics in video games. And one of the points I'm going to be making in there is that the problem with the way most ethical systems work in video games is that the decisions they make they give you are essentially cartoonish. Do you rob the beggar or do you throw a coin in the beggar's cup? Those are like 80s cartoon supervillain kind of decisions. They're not difficult. They're there to branch off parts of a narrative in a story. Real ethical decisions are not like that. They're not choosing between good and evil. They're choosing between 2 different kinds of good or 5 different kinds of evil. You have to actually have these really nuanced appreciations that you're not going to do the right thing. You're going to do a thing that is right according to certain perspectives. And that's what makes these kind of things complicated if you talk about sort of solving the problem, because the solution to that is going to be different depending on what you want to stress. If you want to stress the fact that reviewers are putting out content and they should be compensated, that's a very different perspective from reviewers have an ethical responsibility to their audiences. Because if the audience isn't paying for something, you might not be particularly inclined to believe that that's where your obligations lie. So they're very, very difficult decisions because life is difficult and complicated and there's all different kinds of factors. I would love to make a living doing, Meeple Like Us, but it's not going to happen. And B, I have to come to terms with that because, in order for me to actually potentially make the easy route to money with this, it comes at a cost of what I think is important in content for the site.
Yeah, and that's difficult. Going one little tiny tangent, because I find the question of ethics in video gaming super fascinating.
Yeah, me too.
Obviously, that's like what you teach on and everything. But here's something I've thought about for a long time in that regard, is that, well, a bit of background about myself. I didn't graduate, but I studied philosophy a little bit in college.
Okay.
And the college I went to was from a very virtue ethics background.
Okay. So
we had, my main philosophy professor studied under Alvin Plantinga, who's a big virtue ethicist from Duke.
Yeah.
I think from Duke. Or no, Notre Dame. And A problem I see in video games a lot is that when they try to present moral decision making, it's almost necessarily from a consequentialist point of view.
Yes.
Because in order for it to be a good game, you have to have cause and effect.
Yes.
But if you're trying to do something, like if you have the perspective of someone like a virtue ethicist, how do you translate that into a game form?
Well, I mean,
or can you?
There are huge limitations the way most games ethical systems work, and almost always, I mean, basically, as you say, they have to be focused on what the consequences are, because you cannot assess intention in a video game. So I think the games that have given the most interesting moral systems are games that don't have moral systems in them, or at least they don't have explicit moral systems. So if you look at, for example, Star Wars, light side versus dark side, Mass Effect, Renegade versus Paragon, Fallout, positive versus negative karma. They're basically just, like a meter on a car. Your morality is running empty, so you better fill it up with good acts. It's not a very satisfying system because it is intensely a mechanical system, and that's not what ethics or morality are. But the most interesting examples of it are things like a game called Papers, Please, which is one of my go-to examples for this, where there are no rewards for ethical behaviour, but there are punishments for ethical behaviour. And that's sometimes the case in life as well. If you want to do the good thing in what is... If you don't know Papers, Please, basically what it is, you're playing a border guard on a sort of vaguely satirical Eastern European full of communism country. So very highly authoritarian with a very restrictive immigration policy. And it's your job to enforce that policy. So people come to your booth, they give you their papers, please, which is where that comes from, and you have to look through the papers to see whether or not they are allowed into the country. And the rules become more and more Byzantine and complex as time goes by. And you get paid based on the number you correctly process. And that money that you get is there to support your family at the end of the game. So you've got to pay your rent, you've got to pay for food, your family might get ill, so you have to pay for medicines, you have to, you can upgrade to new premises, you can downgrade. And so basically it's a kind of a very real world kind of impact to this. But you are presented with these opportunities to help people as time goes by. So you might find somebody saying, I've been lured here under false promises, but the person who lured me here is behind me in the queue. So could you refuse their entry so that I could get away from that? And what you're essentially then forced to do is consider whether or not the financial detriment to you is worth doing the right thing. And that doesn't get rewarded or acknowledged or mentioned anywhere in the game. But that is an ethical decision that people can actually relate with, because it's not, oh, here's 10 good points, or we're going to dock you 50 evil points. This is something you have to think about. And it's not a system, as I say, it's not ever expressed in the game, but it comes out of the way the game mechanics work. And it's a very similar thing to how a game called Spec Ops works, which is you start off in a very stereotypical third-person shooter thing. You're essentially killing generic foreigners, as is often the case in these kind of games. And as time goes by, you become less clear about why you're there and why you're killing these people, and eventually they stop being the generic other that is okay for you to kill for whatever reason, and they start becoming people from the same kind of military force as you are, and people all have these different kind of expectations and things, and you don't have any actual choice as to what you do in the game. It's very linear. But the game continually and consistently forces you to answer certain questions, just on the loading screen. And one of those questions is, why are you even doing this? Because it's not fun at a certain point, because the character you're playing becomes increasingly unhinged, increasingly violent, and increasingly difficult to empathize with. So, why are you doing this? Do you feel like a hero yet? And the favourite part of it is, at one point it basically just asks you, why don't you switch off the game? Because engagement with the game itself is a kind of moral culpability. You are choosing to do these things when you could always just not do them. And the thing that makes it interesting for me is that there is, again, not just not a reward for doing that, but there is actively a punishment, and that you don't get to continue on with the game and find out what happens. People don't get rewarded in real life for doing the right thing. Nobody gets rewarded for not stealing. Nobody gets rewarded for not killing people. They get rewarded for, for doing something above and beyond the normal expectation of what good and evil are. So why would you expect a reward when you do something as relatively banal as stop killing people in a video game? So those kind of systems are, I think, fascinating because they are not systems of morality built into games. They're systems that come out of the games, and they force you to... The game has no role in this moral evaluation that you perform for yourself. The ethical audit that you essentially do is entirely internal, and I think it's far, far more effective as a result.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, Spec Ops was... At a certain point, it just got absolutely frustrating because you're like...
Don't do that.
The game's like trying to tell you to stop playing it, but it's like...
But I want to see what happens.
It was a really weird disconnect, and it's like, I want to play the game. Like, you're trying to tell me something, but I can't be told it if I am also being told to not listen. Yeah. Which is a very strange experience. I have Papers, Please, but I've never actually played it. Do you find that these kinds of discussions are happening more and more in video games?
I think so, yeah.
Are there more games coming out that are going to be like this?
Well, I mean, if you look at things like This War of Mine, or games that have That Dragon Cancer, as an example, which was not so much an ethical system, but a game of meaningful storytelling. These kind of games are becoming more and more common because the audience is becoming more and more receptive to these. And if you look at things like, there's a game called Gone Home, which is essentially, it's about you arrive at your parents' house, it's empty, there's things missing, your sister was supposed to be there and she's not, and you basically explore the house and just find out why. And it's what's sometimes derogatively referred to as a walking simulator. So you just wander around and there's no real puzzles, you just click on things and you uncover more of the story as you go on. But the role that I've seen these kind of games is not in terms of them being what we traditionally think of as video games, in terms of they test your physical skills or they test your logical skills, or they're basically a test of your ability to accomplish a task. I think these are a budding genre of games that are mostly about testing your empathic abilities, your ability to feel something about a story that's told through the engagement with the environment and such that comes along with it. These kind of games are relatively rare, but they are becoming more and more popular, and they are becoming more and more successful. Firewatch, for example, is basically an empathy builder game that you actually uncover these parts of the story as you go on, and the game itself is not really a game as we tend to think about it, but we're changing the definitions of what video games actually are all the time, and this is one of the ways I think it's changing.
Yeah. Do you see any examples or any tendencies in the board game world to experience these, or to investigate these kinds of things? It's a much more difficult medium to do it in, I think. It
is an incredibly difficult medium to do it in, because the thing about a video game is bits of it can be hidden from the players. Lots of it can be hidden from the players. Nothing really, aside from app-driven games, nothing really can be hidden from the player in the board game. It all has to be there, because you need to be the one to execute on how the various mechanics work. Speaking of review copies, I did try to get a review copy of This War of Mine because I wanted to potentially reference that in the talk I'm going to be giving at the weekend. Didn't actually happen in the end, but I think, based on what I've heard of it, so I haven't actually seen it myself, but based on what I've heard of it, it seems to be one that is about engaging with a game beyond its simple mechanics and more about what the story elements it brings out. And The Grizzled is another example of a game where you're actually looking at more of an emotional content than you tend to get with board games. But mostly, I think, if you're exploring that kind of space, you're usually looking at role-playing games, which are essentially, in a box, the perfect way to explore potentially troublesome ethical situations. And the interesting thing about role-playing games is they do give you an opportunity to consider intent versus consequence, and they give you an opportunity to consider the social ethics of engaging with something, because that's something that we haven't even touched on there, which is sometimes there is an ethics that arises from social dynamics, and those social dynamics might be, for example, don't flip the table in a board game. That's unethical to do that just because you're in a bad mood. Or they might be something like, we've house ruled that this is not something that you're going to do because we found out that this is unfair to the rest of the players. You start off with a particular... A Few Acres of Snow, for example, has a strategy that if you play it from the beginning, you'll almost certainly win because it's impossible for anybody else to recover from that. So you can house rule that and you can say it is unethical within this group for that to be done so that we can keep the game actually going. But role-playing games in particular let you explore the social dynamics of ethics in play rather than sort of at the meta level of this. Board games in general, having a look at my shelves, I can't see many of them that I think would be good touchstones for serious explorations of meaningful story and meaningful empathy in games. But who knows what's going to happen?
The one other example I can think of is with historical war games or just really deep historical games generally, is that they can reveal how the designer looks at history and how they look at conflict. But that's just in the design itself, not necessarily in the decisions that people are making within the game.
Yeah. I mean, something like Twilight Struggle, for example, which taught me more about the incentives of the Cold War than anything else I've ever encountered. Because until I played Twilight Struggle, I never understood the idea of nuclear brinkmanship. I never understood why the idea of mutually assured destruction would make sense. I mean, it just seems so bizarrely illogical. I mean, you understand the theory of it as in, if they can destroy us, we need to be able to destroy them. But why would you let that circumstance emerge? And then when you play Twilight Struggle, you actually go, I see. I see why that's actually a thing, because I'm doing that now. And when you follow that path people have laid for you, you actually do get a chance to learn a bit about yourself and also about the circumstance under which you find yourself, because ethics are always contextual.
Right, yeah. Well, was there anything else you wanted to talk about? We went over a lot here.
We certainly did. We have explored a huge amount of territory, some of it even related to board games.
Yeah, maybe, I don't know, 30-40%. That's like pretty good, I think. I enjoy going off in tangents, so I think the listeners will be fine with it. Or at least they've been trained to be used to it by now.
Oh, here's hoping. I mean, all I can really remember of some of the conversation was I expressed some strong views about the Nazis, and I'm kind of hoping I came down on the negative side of them. But I think you did. I don't really remember. And when you do these kind of things, you think to yourself, what did I say? How is that going to come back to haunt me? So just don't worry. Just to reiterate, I think the Nazis were terrible. That's where I'm happy to end it.
Ditto. Oh, man. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on here. This has been a fantastic conversation. I think people will find a lot to think about from it.
Well, I've thoroughly enjoyed myself. Thank you very much for having me.
Well, great. I'm glad you enjoyed it. And if some other weird controversy comes up in the future with board gaming, maybe I'll have you on again. Or if you just want to chat anytime.
Fantastic. No, I'll take you up on that.
Great. Well, that has been the podcast for today. Remember to check out thethoughtfulgamer.com and check out also Meeple Like Us, which is meeplelikeus.co.uk.
That's it.
And check us out on Twitter. And are you on Facebook too?
Yes, under the same name, Meeple Like Us.
Yeah, just look it up. You'll get it all from the website. And don't forget to rate and review this podcast on iTunes. Since we talked about it a little bit in the podcast, I guess I'll announce this right now officially that, or we talked about like monetary incentives and stuff, that I am planning to launch on Patreon sometime in October. I don't have the exact date yet, but if you do like The Thoughtful Gamer, keep that in mind. I'll have more specific announcements in the future about that so I can start improving my equipment quality and eventually hopefully getting a bit of money from this endeavor. Thanks again for listening, and I'll talk to you again soon. Bye.